And for today's Objective 2, we're going to talk about Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury, and the nation's finances. Now, the big idea of this objective is that the Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, developed a financial plan for the national government. He tackled the problem of settling the nation and the state's debts. Thomas Jefferson opposed Alexander Hamilton on the government and on the economy. And Alexander Hamilton created a national bank to strengthen the U.S. economy, which Thomas Jefferson also didn't like. Alexander Hamilton had developed a three-point plan on how to solve the nation's financial problem. You'll notice of the state debt represented about 25 million of the country's entire debt. Domestic debt, which is money that we owed to businesses within the United States, such as when the United States government says we need a bunch of guns to fight this Revolutionary War and we'll pay you back later, or foreign debt, such as money that France had loaned us to fight the Revolutionary War against Britain. Hamilton's plan was a three-point plan. The first plan is to deal with the debt. He wanted to take on the foreign and domestic debt by replacing creditors' old, low-value bonds with new interest-bearing bonds. So, for example, anybody who had taken out bonds that said, the United States, we will loan the United States government $25, for example, and then the United States government will give us $30 later, Hamilton wanted to replace these. He was going to replace them with bonds that would go up in time, such as with interest. So we will pay you $27 for them now, even though they're really worth 30, and they will go up 5% over time. Hamilton also wanted to take over most of the state's 25 million Revolutionary War debts. This would free up money for the states so that the states could get on with business and trade and financing farms and things like that. Now, a lot of states really didn't like this idea, the states especially that had already paid off their Revolutionary War debts, such as Virginia. Remember, Virginia was the biggest state at the time. They didn't like this, but the smaller states, which hadn't paid off their war debts yet, really liked Alexander Hamilton's plans. Part 2 of Hamilton's plan was to gain revenue. The United States government had to do something to make more money, and for the government to make money, that means higher taxes. Now, Hamilton's plan was to pass a tariff that would both bring money in and help American manufacturers. A tariff is a tax on foreign goods. That's a big vocab word that you're going to need to know throughout the rest of the school year. Tariff is a tax on foreign goods. So every time money came into the country, or every time goods came into the country, for example, suppose Britain wanted to come into the United States and sell tea, they would have to pay 5% of however much their tea was worth in order to sell it here in the United States. Now, the British tea makers weren't just going to eat this themselves, they were going to pass that on to the consumers. So, for example, the prices on tea would go up because the British merchants had to pay more just to sell it here. So tea prices go up, which makes some American citizens very angry. But it does make more money for the United States government, and it makes people want to buy things that are made in the United States, such as instead of buying tea from Britain, they would want to buy tea that was made here because it was cheaper. The goods coming into the United States had a tariff on them, so they cost more. Part 3 of Hamilton's plan was to stabilize the banking system. This would create a national bank and a national mint. The national mint would be in charge of making money for the United States, and the national bank would be in charge of loaning money to smaller banks or state banks. So as we said, the first part of Hamilton's plan was to take on this problem of a national debt and state debt. As the Secretary of Treasury, this was his biggest challenge. He had to take on the debt that was owed by the United States. The United States owed 11.7 million to foreign countries and 40.4 million to U.S. citizens who had purchased bonds. These are what we were talking about before, where people would pay $25 to buy a bond for the United States. And then that money was basically loaned to the United States, and then when they would go cash in that bond later, that's when the United States pays them back. People still buy these bonds all the time now. If any of you or any of your parents have savings bonds, that's almost exactly what they are. The United States government sold a lot of these bonds to help finance the Revolutionary War. Hamilton had planned to pay foreign debt first, and all of the debt at full value. Some politicians, including Thomas Jefferson, opposed this plan, but Hamilton went ahead with it and wasn't really worried about what Jefferson thought. Hamilton and Jefferson didn't agree much at all on anything that has to do with the economy, but Hamilton's position was that I'm the Secretary of the Treasury, you're the Secretary of State. I don't tell you what we should be doing with France, so you don't tell me what we should be doing with the economy. It's important to remember as well that President Washington had appointed Hamilton to be President or Secretary of the Treasury, and Washington generally agreed with a lot of Hamilton's ideas on the economy. Now, the individual states still owed about $25 million for Revolutionary War expenses. Hamilton wanted to help the states by having the federal government pay part of the states' debts to help out the national and the states' economy. Most of the states in the South did not like this idea because they had already paid back most of theirs. However, Hamilton wins the South's support because he agrees to move the nation's capital. The nation's capital had been in New York, which is very north, obviously, and that's the reason why the southern states didn't like it there. Now, Hamilton's plan is that he makes a deal and says if you support this plan and allow the national government to pay back these debts for the states, and it frees up more money for the states, and it gives the citizens more trust in their national government because it's doing things to help them, he says that he will move the nation's capital, or he will encourage Washington to move the nation's capital, from New York to Philadelphia. That wasn't quite far enough south for a lot of the people in the South, but he promises that they're going to buy land. Right at the time, it was a swamp just outside of Maryland, which eventually gets turned into Washington, D.C., or the District of Columbia. Now, as we talked about, Thomas Jefferson doesn't really agree with much on Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton believes in a strong central government. Jefferson didn't. Jefferson believed in a strong states governments. Hamilton wanted a balance of power between the mass of the people and the wealthier citizens. Hamilton also wanted to promote manufacturing and business. Remember, this is during the Industrial Revolution. Hamilton wanted to support the factories and manufacturing, and he wanted high tariffs on foreign goods, because what this means is that for foreigners to bring in goods to sell, such as British bringing in tea, it would cost them more money to sell those things to the United States citizens. That would make the cost of those things more expensive, which means American citizens would buy things that were made here at home. Jefferson doesn't agree with most of Hamilton's ideas. He wanted to protect the state's powers. Thomas Jefferson was not at the Constitutional Convention when the Constitution was written, and he was one. If he had been here, he would have been an anti-federalist. He thought that it gave too much power to the federal government. At the time, he was serving as an ambassador to France, so he was representing the United States in France. Jefferson believed that it was the right of the people to rule the country, and that's why he supported agriculture and farmers. Jefferson felt like Hamilton's ideas to support manufacturing and trade only supported the wealthy people who could afford to build factories and build ships to trade the goods made in factories. He didn't feel like it did a lot to support the poor farmers. Jefferson also wanted lower tariffs because it keeps the costs down on all the goods. So even though it would have meant buying more goods that were made overseas, such as British tea, it would have kept the cost of that tea down. Jefferson believes that not only is this true of things like tea, which is the example that I'm using, but it was also true of things like cloth for making things, or shirts, textiles, things like that, or as well as tools that farmers needed. Hamilton creates a national bank in which the government can safely deposit its money. Now, that was one of the problems under the Articles of Confederation, is that even when the United States government did get a little bit of money, remember they couldn't tax under the Articles, they can under the new Constitution, they didn't really have anywhere safe to put their money. So they never wanted to keep a whole bunch of it because they could really only take what they couldn't save for anything. The national government would get money from the states and then almost immediately have to turn around and pay something off. This bank would also make loans to the government, such as if it needed to loan money to the United States government to pay for a war, and it would loan out money to smaller banks and businesses, or people who wanted to open up factories. Hamilton knew that the states' rights supporters would oppose his idea. He knew that people like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who believed in strong states' rights, were not going to like the national bank. So one of the things that he does is he suggests that they limit the national bank to a 20-year charter. So the national bank would only exist for 20 years, and then if they decided that it wasn't working, they would have the ability to get rid of it later. Hamilton, of course, was hoping that that wasn't going to happen. Jefferson and Madison said that Hamilton's plans gave way too much power to the national government, and that the Constitution did not give Congress the power to create a bank. If you read through the Constitution, nowhere in there does it say anything about banks. They favored a strict construction view of the Constitution, meaning that the national government can only do exactly what the Constitution says it can do. Now, Alexander Hamilton and people who supported him believe in a loose construction of the Constitution. They believe that, for example, just because the Constitution doesn't say that the national government can create a bank, it also doesn't say that they can't. So if it doesn't guarantee a power to the state, then that means that the federal government has that power. President Washington and the new Congress agreed with Alexander Hamilton, so they believe that the bank would provide some stability for the U.S. economy. In this case, they believe in a loose construction or a loose interpretation of the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't say that they can, but it doesn't say that they can't, so they go with it. And the Bank of the United States is created. It's the country's first national bank, and it was chartered in 1791. That'll be the end of our Objective 2 podcast. Please make sure that you are prepared to oral defense these review questions and make sure that you answer them today. Question number 1, what was Alexander Hamilton's plan for settling the nation's debt? Remember, there were 3 parts to that. What is the difference between a strict construction or interpretation of the Constitution and a loose construction of the Constitution? Alexander Hamilton believed one thing, Thomas Jefferson believed another. Why did Thomas Jefferson and James Madison disagree with Alexander Hamilton about the national debt and the economy? Question number 4, who do you agree with? Do you agree with Alexander Hamilton in a loose construction of the Constitution, or in Thomas Jefferson in a strict construction of the Constitution? And question number 5, review the rubric and self-assess on your objective sheet.